Hello, welcome. My name is Frederick Schmidt. I hold the Reuben Job Chair in Spiritual Formation at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of the seminary and my co-host, Daniel Wolpert. I would also like to thank Garrett's Assistant Vice President for Marketing and Communications, Shane Nichols, who gave and is giving generously of his time today to make this forum possible. COVID-19 and the emergency protocols governing our national response have changed the way in which chaplains and pastors provide spiritual care. While circumstances vary widely across the nation, parish clergy and chaplains find themselves dealing with strictures and challenges of an unprecedented nature. In this 90-minute long Zoom event, panelists will frame the conversation with brief opening remarks and set the stage for conversation, thought, and reflection on the way in which our efforts and the ways in which our efforts to provide spiritual care have changed and the future of spiritual care in a post-pandemic world. And I should just make sure that everyone can hear me before I go on. Great, thanks. Our panel today includes the Reverend Marilyn J.D. Barnes, a board-certified chaplain and Vice President of Mission and Spiritual Care in the Advocate Aurora Healthcare System. Welcome, Marilyn. The Reverend Thomas S. Rogers III, an ACPE certified educator, board certified chaplain, and executive director of Bishop Anderson House at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. Welcome, Tommy. And my co-host, Daniel Wolpert, who is co-founder and executive director of the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. Before I make a few opening remarks, allow me to make some observations about the way in which we will proceed. One, we ask that you remain muted until we call upon you to speak. That will eliminate distracting background noise, and the button for that is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Two, if you have an observation or a question, please simply leave your name in the chat room, the button for which you will find at the bottom of your screen in the center. We ask that you leave only your name because it will make it easier to identify those who are interested in raising a question or making an observation. Three, when we do call upon you, if you have comments that require a response, we ask that you identify the panelists to whom your comment or question is addressed. On our format, each of the panelists will make some opening remarks, roughly 7 minutes in length, and then we will open up to your comments and questions. Those of us who are on the panel do not consider ourselves the resident experts today. Rather, as your colleagues, we are grateful that you are here and that you are willing to reflect on the place that we all find ourselves. So let me begin with a few of my own remarks. More than 3 years ago, with the leadership of my friend and colleague Jeffrey Bishop and another colleague, Philip Roseman, we explored the changing face of soul and body care from the Enlightenment forward. It is impossible to recapitulate that account here, but what we observed, I believe, set the stage for what we are experiencing now. The place of illness and death in modern medicine is very different from its place prior to the Enlightenment. In the Middle Ages, disease and death in the church had its locus in the liturgical life of the monastery. The sick possessed a firm place in the monastic practice of charity, which radiated out from the celebration of word and sacrament. The care for the sick and dying was also anchored in the liturgical and communal narrative of the church, which was tied to the cross as a symbol of human finitude and death. In turn, That narrative found expression in the layout of monastic space, in the union of medicine and spirituality, in the person of the monk who was also physician, and in many other aspects of daily life. Moreover, death did not mean the end of life, but the transition from one life to another. However, beginning in the late Middle Ages, death and disease slowly drifted from those liturgical and communal ties and were housed instead in the body. From the late 18th and early 19th centuries until the 1960s, something of the communal dynamic remained, in part because physicians depended upon the beating heart when announcing that someone had died. The heart, understood through its rich and mythical connotations as the center of life, kept the event of death connected with the emotional and spiritual life of the person and with his or her community as well. But even that place was lost technologically in the late 1960s with the first heart transplant. The heart became a mere body part, separable from the person and her community, a tool that could be replaced. And eventually death was situated in the brain, where only a physician armed with an EKG could pronounce on the end of life. In this context, both parish clergy and hospital chaplains have worked hard and with varied levels of success to carve out and recreate a sacramental and spiritual space which our medieval predecessors took for granted. But with the spread of COVID-19, I think it is fair to say that we may have entered into a completely new chapter of the history that my colleagues and I outlined. Thanks to the provisions of the Hospital Incident Command, which was developed in the 1970s and standardized across the country after 9/11, parish clergy have been forbidden admission to hospitals, and with exceptions, chaplains have been required to care for patients remotely or at a considerable distance. So here we are in a world that has shifted dramatically yet again. And the terrain has shifted, not just in modern hospitals, but in the life of the church itself. To be sure, the church is not its buildings, but the body imagery of both John's gospel and the Pauline epistles suggests an intimacy with one another, which this virus has made impossible. Defining this new space and accounting for the ways in which things have changed is the focus of this forum, and I look forward to hearing what others have to say. For my own part, I will reiterate an observation that I made in the article that prompted Daniel to suggest that we have this discussion. The assumptions that govern the millennia-long ministry that I have described are deeply rooted in the theology of the church. Ministry to the ill and dying is embedded in the ministry of Jesus, who touched and was touched in spite of taboos that were every bit as world-ending in the minds of his contemporaries as any medical dangers that we face. It is embedded in our theology of the incarnation that holds that in Christ, God is with us. It is based upon our conviction that this life and preserving it is not and cannot be our ultimate value. And it is embedded in the conviction that the journey into God in Christ is framed, deepened, and nourished by the church's sacraments. Those convictions are not an optional religious nicety. They are, from a Christian point of view, definitional. Until modern medicine severed our connection with God's ill and dying children, they prompted the church and its clergy to risk itself. And though no one should actively seek it, those convictions have martyred millions over the years. So to have abandoned those convictions without question or conversation is perhaps one of the most stunning and sudden shifts in our understanding of the church and the vocation of clergy in historical memory. To be clear, I am not talking about clergy behaving in a way that is willfully blind to scientific truth, blind to what we know about this virus, or blind to its potential effects. I understand that clergy and chaplains have become and can become a vector for the disease. I also understand that in order to be present to those who are infected, clergy will need protective equipment that has been in short supply. Nor am I talking about the kind of behavior advocated by pastors who have called on their members to attend church services without regard for what we know about this virus as a test of faith. That, I believe, is a magical bastardization of the gospel. But what is at stake is our understanding of who we are in Christ, what makes for life in Christ, and therefore what matters most. At stake, too, is the inevitable grief and moral injury that flows from the policies that we have implemented. Patients, families, chaplains, parish clergy, and hospital staff alike have all been drawn into a protocol that is designed to ensure physical safety, but makes little formal provision for spiritual well-being of anyone involved. And we have yet to grasp the implications of that choice. The questions I would lift up then for all of us are these. One, how do we name the moment in which we find ourselves historically and vocationally? Two, granted the medical realities we face, how should we approach the next and probably inevitable pandemic? And finally, what have we learned and what should we work to change from this experience? I look forward to your thoughts. Marilyn, over to you.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to enter the discussion on this relevant topic and serve with my fellow panelists. According to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the conditions in the places where people live, learn, work, and play affect a wide range of health risks and outcomes. These are the social determinants of health, with 5 key areas of economic stability, education, social and community context, health and healthcare, neighborhood and built environment. Within these 5 areas, religion and spirituality are not included. However, in the midst of this pandemic and previous pandemics, religion and spirituality and treating the human spirit are prominent in the care of patients, family members, and healthcare providers. There are requests for prayers of protection for all those on the front line, prayer requests for those fighting to survive and recover from COVID-19, prayer requests for those who are unable to honor their dead in traditional ritualistic ways, and the request for acknowledgement of grief associated with not being able to gather in places of prayer and worship, especially during Holy Week, Passover, and Ramadan. The human spirit is struggling, perhaps suffering, and it is part of who we are as people, body, mind, and spirit. The challenge is, how do those who treat the human spirit, who are also struggling, develop and implement a strategy to meet the need in non-traditional ways? In my context, how can chaplains be and do honoring social distancing? I'm grateful that in my healthcare system, chaplains are seen as essential team members. We are able to come alongside team members and physicians and patients and families in various ways, some of which include virtual support groups, 24/7 telechaplaincy, daily reflections, overhead prayers, self-care resources, incident command meditative spaces, weekly meditation for team members on YouTube, a video series on self-care and caring for team members, virtual patient visits, family bereavement packets, patient isolation packets, and family grief support calls. While chaplains are grieving the loss of being physically present with patients and family members and being less than 6 feet away from their healthcare colleagues, the goals of care remain the same: active listening, journeying with someone in the grief process, lessening anxiety, being a common presence, aligning a patient's care with their values, demonstrating care and concern, faith affirmation, lessening someone's feeling of isolation, preserving dignity and respect, promoting a sense of peace, and establishing rapport and connectedness. Given the present state, the question is, where do we go from here? I offer that we look at history. This is not the first pandemic where places of worship were closed and chaplains were on the front line partnering with their colleagues. If we look at the London cholera pandemic of 1854, we will see that Reverend Henry Whitehead's interviews within an underserved community that trusted him led to Dr. John Snow determining the source of the outbreak. If we look to the flu pandemic of 1918, places of worship were closed and even served as hospitals. The newspaper printed scriptures, hymns, and sermons. Faith leaders wrote letters encouraging people to worship individually or as family at home. In this time, as chaplains, we use technology to offer spiritual and religious care. As faith leaders, we use technology for virtual Bible study, prayer meetings, and streaming of worship service. I'm wondering how faith leaders can leverage the trust they have with members of communities already suffering from health disparities and who are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic to provide education on the impact of not following social distancing guidelines, washing hands, and wearing face coverings. I'm wondering how preaching and teaching on the sacrifice of being at home, when possible, because a majority of essential workers are comprised of persons who are suffering from health disparities, is really living their humanity, spirituality, and religion. I believe here is an opportunity for healthcare chaplains and faith leaders to partner, not only focused on end of life, virtual visits, and prayer vigils, yet as collaborators on reducing the spread of the virus. Moving beyond what we are missing, seeking to prevent the health disparity gap from growing wider. Within Advocate Aurora Health, we have begun some of this work, and I'm hopeful more will be done across the nation to prevent spread, save lives, and address the injustice of health disparities. I believe that as faith leaders and as healthcare chaplains, together, we can achieve this goal. Tommy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Marilyn. Really similar with Chaplain Marilyn. I have some similar observations. Just to kind of put it in context, here at Bishop Anderson House, we sit on the campus of Rush University Medical Center, which is a non-for-profit health system here in Chicago. And we also have a relationship with Sturger Hospital of Cook County, which is the public county hospital here. And those two places, even though they're literally almost across the street from one another, are quite different. So similar to what Chaplain Marilyn was saying, our chaplains have been viewed as essential staff. And one of the things that I've really appreciated during this time is the way that leadership has really looked to chaplains, to clinical pastoral educators for guidance in developing policies and procedures right now. One of our chaplains, for example, was on the committee that decided how would we handle a death in the emergency department, and then how can we also meet the needs of families who want to see their loved ones. And the hospital was very open to that. And I'm aware not all hospitals have that kind of role where chaplains are really integrated and part of the whole system. One of the pieces that's really been exciting over at Stroger Hospital of Cook County has been the way that this has opened the door for Chaplain Michael to build relationships with staff. He was just recently invited onto a subcommittee of the ethics panel, which, just like you were talking about with moral injury, is looking at when those difficult decisions come up, having a chaplain on that team to help people process those decisions, and then to give some guidance and to be a less anxious presence than the other people that are on those committees are really, really important. I'll also own some of my bias. I have not been the biggest fan of telechaplaincy. I've been really resistant to that. I've also been really resistant to doing any education via Zoom or WebEx. And this has forced me to open my heart and mind more to that. I've done clinical pastoral education groups in this way. I've been surprised at the way we've built community and been able to have some sense of normalcy in this virtual environment. And then also, just recently, for example, we had a patient who the medical team thought had suicidal ideation. And it turned out that this patient was a relatively healthy young individual, and she just didn't want to be hooked to a ventilator. And she was really missing having the connection with her family. And so one of the chaplains was able to, on an iPad, connect them and get them to talk for a little while. And just in that 15 or 20-minute conversation, the patient decided that if it was absolutely medically necessary, that she would agree to be put on a ventilator. So the issue wasn't that she had a psychological disorder or had suicidal ideation. It was just she missed that community and that connection to her family. And that sort of put her back in touch with her values. And I also think the role of chaplains here, especially in both contexts, has been to create a safe space for people to ventilate their emotions. I know some clergy in different denominations are required to have that one unit of clinical pastoral education, which some people loved and had a great experience, other people hated and were ready to run out the door from. Yet that training is so valuable to be able to be a less anxious presence as you're supporting people. And that's really my hope. And I see it happening all the time in the hospitals that we provide chaplain services, where we can set in and support families in family meetings making difficult decisions with the best information possible. And kind of with what Fred was saying earlier, I do view the ministry that we have here as very sacramental, but it's not what you would see on a Sunday morning. So when I do a baptism here, it's a little different. I don't have all the things I have in a church on Sunday morning. I might be working with a family that's of a different tradition, so I'm looking to adapt that because I'm always aware of the diversity of the patients that I come in contact with, and also the diversity of the nursing staff. Right now it's Nurses Week, and here we're getting ready to bless hands. And we've developed a prayer for that, and we're just going to do a drop of oil where nurses can just rub that in to avoid the contact precautions, just as a way of saying thank you for all they're doing right now. Yet that's probably not what a blessing of hands would look like in most of our faith communities. So I think one of the pieces I love about my work as a chaplain is being able to take things and make them creative and to fit the context that I'm currently working in. So I think this is a time of opportunity for those chaplains who are given space to be in leadership and to be a voice on hospital incident command in terms of developing policies and procedures. And I'm aware that I'm really lucky here at Rush that spiritual care is valued and our voices are valued so much that we're able to do that. Over to you, Daniel.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, greetings and welcome to all of you. This is really exciting that you guys are all here. I want to thank Fred and Tommy and Marilyn for being here as well. Fred's openness to get going on this. You know, I read this article that he wrote and sent him an email and said, hey, yeah, let's have this conversation. And now here we are. And so also to the folks at Garrett. And, you know, I feel like just the fact that this has happened, that we have all come together like this so quickly to have this conversation, to me really speaks to the power of this moment and what is going on. And one of the things that I and many others, I think, have talked a lot about in terms of this pandemic, right, is that it truly is apocalyptic in the literal sense of that word, that it is this unveiling for so many things. A little bit more just about my background. I mean, I have a very eclectic background, and my primary vocation is as a student of the spiritual life, but I've been involved in healing work as well as scientific work off and on for a long, long time. And so, you know, this topic is of really particular interest to me because, you know, like the history, like what Fred has outlined with this history, you know, I've very much seen this movement of spirituality, spiritual community, the church, being very much at the center of work in healing spaces. And increasingly, of course, as we have become a much more materialistic society, a society that not only embraces science, but then often veers off to scientism, which is the kind of scientific fundamentalism. In many ways, and in many healing spaces, spirituality has all but disappeared. And I mean, it's wonderful that we have, you know, these two great representatives from healing institutions that have not done that. But you know, it's important to be aware that our healing institutions vary widely, right, in regard to how open they are to being populated by and engaged with folks who are religious professionals. I was recently in Pittsburgh visiting a hospital, a maternity hospital there that did about 2,000 births a month. So this is an enormous hospital. They had no chaplaincy services of any kind, and did not see that as an important part of the work that they were doing. And so I think that, you know, part of then what we are challenged by in this pandemic, and we're really faced with a great deal of anxiety and concern about this illness, about how we relate to each other, about being disconnected and in isolation, I think really is a great opportunity for us to think about what is our metaphysical and spiritual orientation, right? And I often talk about the fact that in our society, in many ways, we practice a kind of functional atheism, that even those of us that say we believe in God or talk about God, seem to appreciate God, we often act as if God is not real and present. And again, I think this is a real outgrowth of this materialistic view that we have increasingly embraced, and we're very enamored by materialism, right? By our cool stuff, by the fact that we've got these great computers, and here we are on the internet. But of course, those of us that are interested in the spiritual life have to have some way of acknowledging and accounting for the fact that non-material reality is just as real and just as important as material reality. And so I do think that for those of us who are spiritual leaders, we not only have the challenge of kind of asserting that and describing that and engaging that, but we also have the great opportunity to meet people when that kind of very natural desire to understand who they are in a deeper way, to when they are encountering their fears, their concerns, the deep existential questions that we know arise in the face of severe illness and disruption, we have a tremendous opportunity for teaching and practice. And, both of our chaplains here have talked about that, the different safe spaces that they provide, the different kinds of practices, the way of being a non-anxious presence. These things are all very healing and tremendously powerful. And so, I think that to me, we are really called to not only think about these things, but to also push back against healthcare systems that sometimes talk about people as body, mind, and spirit, and yet, 99% of the effort and the dollars are on the body part, right? And sometimes the mind and spirit part very much take a back seat. I think the other thing that this pandemic really, to me, is encouraging us to do is to have much more serious and open conversations about death and dying. We are a very death-denying culture. I think all of us are probably aware of that. And, instinctively, when we have reacted to this pandemic and said to people who are quite elderly and towards the end of their life, oh, in order to treat this, to quote, treat this, we have to lock you in a room and isolate you from everybody important in your life. And that's the right thing to do. That in many ways reflects our death-denying culture, right? Because we assume that the right thing to do is to do that with the hopes of curing them of this illness. I know personally, as I've done a lot of reflecting about this, if I get to be 85 years old and I get a serious illness, the last thing I would want to do in the world would be to be separated from everybody for the sake of perhaps physically getting better. And of course, I would want them to be able to be safe if people could be nearby. But to me, I think we say this all the time, that there are worse things than death, but we don't really act that way in the world. And so I think that this pandemic can really encourage us to have these hard conversations, and that can actually be very exciting and a great opportunity for growth and a deepening of our understanding and practice of spiritual community.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Tommy. Marilyn, it's your turn to comment, to make observations, to give us some window into what you've been struggling with, into some window into perhaps some success you've had, either as a chaplain or as parish clergy or serving in other capacities. So we're interested in your observations, questions, and if you'll just register those in the chat window, we'll call on you as those appear. Wayne Scherer. Go ahead and unmute, Wayne, and introduce yourself and tell us what you're thinking.
My name is Wayne Scherer. I'm an Episcopal priest at St. James Hackettstown in New Jersey. And we've, of course, had a lot of infection in New Jersey. And my mother was 90 years old and was one of the people who came down with COVID-19. She died 2 days ago on Sunday. And last week, while she was in the hospital, I was able to actually go into her room with full protective gear, helmet, gown, gloves, the whole 9 yards. And it was extremely important for her that there was somebody who was able to be there for an extended period of time, because the medical personnel would come in, do their job, and leave. And I was able to be there as a connection to other family members. I was able to bring the sacrament of anointing to her. And if the institution permits it. I think it's something that nobody else can do. And I'm very thankful that I was able to do that. I also left my card with the nurses station, and I said I was available to pray or anoint any other patients or meet with family members of people who were coming there.
Thank you, Wayne. That's a really helpful set of observations, and especially as it covers not just the demands of ministry, but your own personal journey in that regard. Thank you. Cynthia Astle. Cynthia, would you introduce yourself?
There, I hope I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Yes, I'm Cynthia Astle, and I live here in Dallas, Texas. I am a seminary-trained spiritual director. I have, over the past 20 years, done a great deal of work with death and dying. And I've been a certified advanced care planner. And one of the things that distresses me a great deal about the current situation is the same thing that Wayne just described, the fact that patients are being isolated from those who can bring them the most spiritual comfort at the most crucial time in their lives. In 2000, I believe it was 2000, I worked with a local committee that was part of the public television program with Bill Moyers called On Our Own Terms, which had to do with death and dying. And at that time, I got to know some people who were on one of the medical ethics committees in a local hospital system. And I'm wondering if one of the ways to approach what we're also concerned about is for us who have done this type of work, who are hospital chaplains or parish clergy or lay people like myself who work with spiritual direction, to contact our local hospital systems and ask who their ethics committee is and whether or not we can meet with them in regards to the incident protocols and perhaps effect a change in what's going on. I have had a great deal of contact in these last few weeks with people who have asked me to pray for a family member who's in the hospital, to pray for a healthcare worker who has sustained a moral injury because of decisions that he or she has had to make. And it is heartbreaking to not be in the physical presence of these people and to be able to offer the ministry, the healing ministry of our faith to them. And so I guess I should direct my question to all of the panel. Do you think that us making an active effort to connect with our local medical ethics committees would be a helpful action in the midst of the pandemic? Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Fred, I could take that. I can speak to Advocate Aurora Health. We have I will say, a very robust ethics organization. So not just a committee. We actually have a vice president of ethics, and very integrated in decisions that are being made when we are talking about visitors and health disparities and having persons isolated from their loved ones. We also not only, I will say that it's the Ethics Committee, Mission and Spiritual Care, and Diversity and Inclusion that are all coming together as we're looking at policy for how we're approaching COVID-19 as we respect individuals, their dignity, their respect, which includes their spirituality. And understanding, asking what is important to them. So is it important, for example, if you're Catholic and since you cannot receive the Eucharist every day, what can we do to provide for you? And if that person is intubated, asking their loved one, what is it that we can provide while we're balancing, right, the need to protect those on the front line for the long term, because we need PPE, we need them to be healthy. And so how can we do things virtually, and how on an individual basis can we address other things? So I will say that it is definitely a tightrope balancing act of how we can do that. And I will say for my healthcare system, that's what we're doing. And I know other healthcare systems are also coming together, trying to really work through how we balance the need to support our team members and physicians and protect them and their mental health and spiritual health, as well as patients and families. So thank you for bringing that up. It is so very important.
Thanks, Marilyn. Tommy, any thoughts on that particular subject?
You know, I was just thinking before I went to Johns Hopkins and in my supervisory training, I was in a very small town in Frederick, Maryland, and they had one chaplain for this really good-sized regional hospital. And she, of course, couldn't meet all the spiritual care needs. And one of the things I appreciated was she developed sort of a group of not lay so much, but local clergy that wanted to volunteer their time. And so I think making yourself known to the hospital that you're available, that you have training. One of the issues at one of the hospitals we do ministry in is there's not really a screening mechanism. And so we've had people that I would say have good intentions, but don't have training and are visiting. And so like to give you an example, they'll take a track. I don't know if any of you are more evangelical or fundamentalist Christians and remember what those look like. But, you know, they'll have things like turn or burn, you know, and that's not the way that you engage people who are in spiritual crisis. And so there needs to be some sort of a screening mechanism in a hospital so that not everyone is coming in, as well-intentioned as they are, that doesn't have some level of training. And so I think that's an important critical piece too. And most hospitals, unless they're faith-based or have a department of spiritual care, don't know what they're looking for. So I think some education in a humble way, not in a way of going in a one-up relationship of, I know something I want to teach you, but in a, you know, can we build a relationship and foster a relationship? And here's what, you know, good spiritual care looks like. If they don't have it in their budget to have chaplaincy or spiritual care, I think would be really important and valuable.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, you know, you've raised a really important question, Cynthia, and I think that one of the questions, you know, to use Daniel's observation that this pandemic has been something of a revelation of what our world is like. I think one of the things it's revealed is that perhaps some of the partnerships that we have between lay people and clergy who largely live out their lives in a parish context don't necessarily have particularly strong relationships with chaplains, who in a set of circumstances like this are more likely, if anyone is, to be the people who are immediately available to people in the hospital. So the only thing I would add to all of this is that it may be that one of the things for us all to talk about revolves around what those partnerships look like and how that kind of work gets done when the point of contact is narrowed by the nature of the crisis. I don't think that was anticipated in the protocols. It certainly didn't apply at 9/11. And so I think it's all caught us a bit flat-footed in that regard. And if anyone here today has observations about the kind of partnerships you've been able to work from, it would be good to hear about it. Thanks again. In following the chat, it looks like there's been some questions about prison ministry and about connections with inmates. And at least one of our participants made the observation that people are not allowed to work with inmates in Pennsylvania. I wondered whether anyone else had observations about prison ministry specifically. If you do, please feel free to go ahead and unmute and make an observation while we're looking at that issue.
Carl Chamberlain here. I'm a chaplain with New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. If folks have ever watched the movie series Dannemora, that's one of my locations. Corrections chaplains in the state of New York, Protestants are vetted by the New York State Council of Churches, and that's my situation. The job title is a state government title, so we're technically working for the government, which provides our benefits, including paycheck and other family coverages. We also work within our job title, and at this point, the core operations for the prison system, of course, is safety and security of the inmates and the staff. As non-essential staff, and that comes under my job title, I'm right now not going in and haven't since mid-March. The first thing that happened, try to control the health issue, was to not have visits. There are no visits coming from family. Second thing that was done was to limit transfers between facilities. So each facility is effectively a closed unit now, rather than the statewide being a closed unit. And then the question about lawyers' access for legal issues. Lawyers can come in, but most of them are canceling or rescheduling. If they do come in, there's a physical barrier between the inmate and their attorney in a private setting, but under supervision and under guard. How do we do chaplaincy? The bulk of our work right now is monitoring the holidays. Right now we're in the midst of Ramadan. We're making plans coming up for Pentecost celebration for the Protestants. There's the ongoing question of meals. Some other faith communities are eligible for kosher meals, not just the Jewish community either. So a couple of our folks in each facility are in doing death visits, monitoring the paperwork on a reduced schedule. We do rounds, face-to-face meetings, but right now that's pretty much on an as called rather than a routine basis. I am in touch with the chaplains in the facilities where I serve that are doing the reduced hours. I'm not. I think it's because they've considered me part of that at-risk demographic. I'm older. My wife is older. We have some accumulated health issues. The union is helpful, so I'm still getting paid. The checks are still getting deposited. But the work I'm doing is waiting to go back in and do what I can. I can't speak to what other prisons and other locations are, but that's what's happening in the state of New York.
Thanks very much, Carl. That's very helpful. Anyone else on this particular subject and on prisons and caring for inmates and prison staff?
Yeah, just to build on what Carl was saying, one of our supervisory education students here at Rush, before this happened, he was doing ministry at the Cook County Jail, and same thing, about mid-March, he was no longer able to do that, to go into the jail to do ministry. So almost exactly what you're experiencing, Carl, is what he's reported here in Chicago as well.
Thanks, Tommy.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
My
Would
name
you
is Earlene
introduce
Austin.
yourself, Carolyn?
My name is Earlene Austin, and I'm an end-of-life specialist trained, a hospital chaplain trained, a lay Eucharistic minister trained. I've also taken education for ministry from a woman who ministers to prisons, and she has been completely knocked out of going in to teach her classes. Having gone to the graduations of many of the prisoners over the last 5 or 6 years, this is such an integral part of not only their well-being, but of their future feelings and psychological outlooks. And so the one thing that she's been doing to the people like myself who are involved with this, and the only thing we can do is to send cards. And they are also necessarily looked at. They have to be in a wet envelope. There are so many restrictions. But at least if there are people who can do something like that and they know someone in prison, and they're being cut off by their family, and certainly this very, very important ministry, to at least send a card to them if they've got the address. But I also have another question, but it's not relating to a prison. So if we have more prison questions, I can sit back and wait.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Erling.
In my pastoral care, I've often gone into a hospital in the place of a priest who couldn't do it, who couldn't make it for several reasons. We had people at the same time all needing it. And I was never stopped because I was known at the hospital. But here's my problem is that currently none of us are allowed to go in. No clergy, no lay ministry, nobody. And having been on a hospice team, which I find essential, especially now, there are usually at least 5 participants. They are the doctor, they are the generalist, the social worker, a patient advocate, and the clergy. So to have all those people still able to function in their capacities and not have the clergy be part and parcel of what's going on, than to go into a room and not have had that exposure, an opportunity to then, be dropped in the middle of it if they're allowed. As the gentleman was saying, he went into the last minute, is criminal, I think. And my question is, who decides that the hospital will not allow clergy, and especially if they're used to having a team? Is it the hospital? Is it the county? Is it the state? Is it federal? I mean, who just says no clergy? And I mean, there have been several people who have been on a hospital from our parish who haven't seen their loved ones for this entire time because they were ill prior, and then it just took over and they weren't allowed to go in at all.
I think you're raising a really important issue, and at least in terms of the reading and reflection that I've devoted to it, at least part of this has to do with the nature of the hospital incident command center, which made some decisions really on one model of healing, which was largely focused on the body itself and on whatever challenge people experienced physically. So I think that's at least part of the problem and part of the reason to have a conversation about just exactly how we navigate situations like this. Marilyn, Tommy, any thoughts about that aspect of things in terms of the hospital?
Yeah, and I'd like to also jump in on that at some point, but you guys could go ahead first.
Was that you, Carl, or?
No, it's me, Daniel.
Oh, I'm sorry, Daniel. Well,
Yeah,
go
no,
ahead. Go ahead, and then we'll let Marilyn or Tommy.
Right. So Arlene, I think the way that you're phrasing that is exactly a reflection of this deeper theological and metaphysical problem.
Absolutely.
Right. And so that if, and it's reflected too in what Carl said about his role in a prison, right? So the chaplain is immediately somehow seen as non-essential staff. Right. And we become second-class citizens because, and again, this is not stated up front, but, actions speak louder than words. What we do is not the real healing thing.
Like you said, right? The physical healing, not the mental and emotional and spiritual.
Yeah. And so that, and again, there are obviously hospital systems that may have some exception to this, but what you're experiencing and talking about, I think, is far more the rule. I mean, it's certainly true here in Minneapolis and all the hospital systems here. And I do feel like we as the church and church leaders have frankly just not done a very good job in addressing and engaging the materialism of our society, right? And this, you know, largely Christianity is based on what we call the three-story universe, right? This metaphysics of earth, heaven, and hell. This is a metaphysics that we know is not real anymore, and an astronomy that we know is not real anymore. But we as the church have done a very poor job of really helping people to articulate and integrate non-material reality and the importance of us as both material and spiritual beings into our basic understanding of life, death, health, healing, all these sorts of things. And so we have a hierarchy of what is really important. And, you know, the doctors do the most important things, right? And I mean, nurses talk about this too, right? I mean, they're also lower on the hierarchy, you know, and so the high touch kinds of activities are simply not seen institutionally as important in health and well-being, but they absolutely are. And so I feel like this is a challenge to the church and to us to start to push back against this and to really talk about, okay, what is this essential and non-essential? You know, the way that people are relating to their minds and their spirits is just as essential as their breathing exercises when they have pneumonia. But so.
Thanks, Daniel.
I appreciate the question as well. Within our healthcare system and others, I'm one of the Transforming Chaplaincy Fellows, which are chaplains who have gone through school to become chaplain researchers. I've reached out to them, and for those who are essential, we are doing a lot of spiritual care for providers, a lot, because they are struggling, right? They're struggling with the long shifts and people dying, and they're used to saving people, and that's not what's really happening consistently here. And so perhaps now is the time in those healthcare systems or in other locations where chaplains are not engaged, or clergy or faith leaders are not engaged, to reach out from a perspective of how they are. How are they doing? How are they dealing with this body, mind, and spirit? And I haven't met a provider who is not struggling. And to establish the partnership there and then to integrate into patient and family care. Going in from a patient and family care perspective, from what I'm hearing you all say, is more of the outsider, but saying to physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, transporters, environmental services, how are you doing? How are you doing? And approaching it that way, and how might I come alongside you, I think could be a way that we could establish a partnership for those who aren't having that support right now.
So as an inroad.
Thanks.
Got it.
Thank you.
And not necessarily in a religious connotation, but in a
relationship.
You as a person. In our healthcare system, we say how you are matters. How you are matters. So if you're upset, if you're sad, if you can't sleep, if you go home and you sit down and you can't move, how you are matters. And to address how they're feeling so that they can be able to provide better care and continue on this journey that's a marathon and not a sprint.
May I sort of say something about that?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm coming from being really retired and off the front lines now, but you're reminding me of what we were doing in New York in the 80s and 90s with homeless people and people with AIDS in hospitals. We flipped it, or I flipped it, in terms of it was the staff first. And it was the doctors that were coming to me and saying, we don't know what to do about this. And these young people that have gone into medicine for healing don't know what to do about this. And that was the way that I gained total acceptance from the medical side and the transport people and all the folk that were there 24/7, when only one little chaplain with a census of 100 people dying with AIDS, you know, I knew I couldn't do it all alone. So I would commend people to sort of flip it and look at the staff, because they're the ones that are there. And it's the opportunity, if you so feel called to evangelizing, to that's the quiet place to do it, along with, you know, traditional healing methods. Okay, that's all. That's my voice from New York in the past.
No, that's good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious if I could just offer one more tidbit as a nurse and chaplain myself.
Sure. And then I'm going to try to get back to the list of questions, but absolutely, since we're on this topic.
Okay. And I just offer, especially being a nurse first and then switching to chaplaincy, I will offer this. First of all, I was really glad people went to the place of working with the staff, because I did put that in the chat as we've been talking, because I think that that's really important and where I find that I'm spending a lot of my time right now. I'm also spending some time, because most of my work is virtual at this point, helping them to know when they're asking questions about how they can meet some of those basic spiritual needs of the patients, helping and giving them some tools and sort of talking with them and talking them through that so they can be the bedside person, because the physical need puts them at the bedside. I will also say that in light of us being chaplains and being there for people's spirituality, there is the component that was brought up early on that we also want to pay attention to science. So I guess the nurse in me understands why the immediate reaction when we were very confused about this pandemic and how it was spreading is to limit the number of people. That makes sense to me. I think what so often happens is that then as we're understanding it better and we're realizing this is going to go on longer than maybe anticipated initially, that it is time to start approaching and saying those spiritual needs are indeed important. And so since people are doing okay with both of us being masked or having more PPE available and all of that, is it time to reevaluate it? That it's not so much, you know, all of a sudden nobody else is essential. It's a reaction to what is occurring because of the spread and the deaths, that then sometimes unless we put spiritual care and well-being back in front of the medical folks, they won't necessarily think, oh, we want to reevaluate this. And as we start to allow others to visit, include them as well. So I just offer that for some perspective.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Doug Bowden. Is Doug there? You're still muted, Doug.
Yeah, not unmuted.
There you go. You're unmuted now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Grateful to be with all of you. My name is Doug Bowden. I'm a retired United Methodist minister serving for 43 years in Northern Illinois, and grateful graduate of Garrett-Evangelical. And a couple of brief thoughts I'm thinking as I'm learning from all of you of Henri Nouwen, and if, who, in the ministry of presence, if he were with us, how much we miss him since 1996, as all of you know, and if you in our imagination how Henri might be working in ministry and serving today as a light for us. And secondly, two of my high school youth from 15 years ago in Faith Church in Freeport, Illinois, are medical doctors now in emergency rooms, one at in ICU in Mount Sinai in New York, and the second ICU doctor in Beaumont Hospitals in Detroit. and what to be grateful for is I've been sending emails and talking on the phone, what would be the best ways of giving support to both of these beloved friends. And thirdly, I'm going to ask your thoughts. I've been encouraged by what David Brooks has been writing in the New York Times on where he sees there is social solidarity. This column on recent column on Friday, where the weavers, the words he's come up with in recent years and his transition in his life, that there is a draw, there's hope. Do you possibly, hopefully, see that too? That there are that we're weaving together in responding much better to this pandemic than I know David Brooks has one thought we might. So thank you for receiving my thoughts and questions.
No, thanks very much, Doug. I think at least one response I would make in terms of where we've come in the course of this pandemic is I think perhaps we've learned just how important relationships are. To turn the lens a little bit and to think about parish life. Over the last 20 years or so, we've become very oriented to program. And the thing that this pandemic has taken away from every church is program as such. And I think we've discovered that our churches, and I think this is probably true for other faith communities as well, is fundamentally more about relationships than it is about programming. And so I'm hopeful that we've learned some of that. I'm also convinced that we're going to have to take a good deal of that learning into the future, that even when we're able to be physically present to one another, if we don't hold on to that realization and find ways to nurture relationship in our communities, we'll have missed a real opportunity and we'll have discarded something that may have been forced on us by the circumstances, but which we can learn from what's happened. Thank you for that question. I think that's very, very important.
May I say something?
Yes, please.
This is Henry Williams. I've been just patiently listening
Sure,
to the conversation, and I'm calling you. I'm in from Southfield, Michigan.
Oh, okay.
And graduate of Garrett, 2011.
Oh, welcome.
And it's just a pleasure to be among you individuals and hearing the different narratives about what's going on. And I am in private practice as a counselor within the state of Michigan. And I pastored in the United Methodist Church for 15 and a half years. And since I've been in private practice, it's been a wonderful experience, and being able to walk with people through a lot of what's especially going on today, a lot of the fears and doubts and concerns about what tomorrow is going to look like. And what I've heard everyone say is that the important thing is to find out what it is that people are in need of, and then be able to come up with something that will help them to get through whatever it is that they're trying to get through. I've heard.
Thank you very much, Henry. I think you're right. It's good that you're here, and appreciate you contributing those thoughts. I was looking through the chat. Al Caldwell.
You can walk with people in a way that will help them.
You can hear me all right?
Oh, I'm sorry, Henry, are you still speaking?
Yes, I was. I mean, if someone, yes, I was.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. If you'll wait just a minute, Al.
Sure, be glad to.
Go ahead and finish up, Henry.
Yeah, I was just injecting, I heard spirituality spoken quite a lot in our conversation here. And I think that's something that we really need to make sure is clearly understood to the larger world, that we are here to serve and not necessarily be served, but to be able to serve. And I'm just kind of listening and observing and taking everything in. And I'm just excited about where I am in this part of my life. I'm a young 72, and but I feel like I'm 18. But I am enjoying life and being able to glean from people like yourselves and be able to carry this out to the community to which I live in. And I'm just appreciating hearing all the conversations.
Thanks, Henry. It's good to hear that you're working on it. I think there's more than enough work out there for all of us.
Yes, yes,
in
there
that
is.
effort.
I want to just say one other thing. As I was, on this journey, one of the things that inspired me to continue to do what I'm doing, I was coming through Beaumont Hospital, and they had a sign up there, neuroscience. And I paused for a moment and thought about that. I said, neuroscience. I said, that's the study of the mind, of the brain. And somewhere I read that Paul said we need to renew our minds daily. And the other part of that was the theological piece, is that all about Isaiah. Said he was a King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and a mighty counselor. And so I said, that's interesting that to me at that time, that the two come together. So that's my faith walk, is carrying those two images with me
Thanks,
each and
Henry.
every day.
Thank you. Alva?
Yeah, I was thinking about this stuff the other day, and it reminded me of an essay I read, 25 years ago or more, by Eugene Smith, a photographer for Look magazine, and he was assigned to go to the hospital clinic in Africa where Albert Schweitzer was. And he said he learned that when the people came to the clinic with these terrible, terrible wounds that had festered and whatever, Schweitzer did what he was taught to do. That is, he amputated the limbs, because that's what you do. And then he learned over time, people quit coming to the clinic because, quote, they would no longer come to a doctor who crippled. And Schweitzer's response to that was, I had to learn new ways to save limbs. And I thought that that's basically where the church is right now with these issues of pastoral care, theology. We're learning new ways to save limbs, to save people, to invest in it. And when I was in seminary years ago, I'm retired from Garrett now for a long time, but when I was a student there, we argued fiercely over issues. How do you deal with a person? Can you be theologically correct and pastorally correct at the same time? And some of that is maybe used in different language now, but we're kind of back to how do we learn new ways to save limbs? So that's more an observation and not a question, but I just wanted to share that thought with you folks. Thanks for giving me a little audience here.
Thanks, Alva. That's a really vivid metaphor and worth pondering. It really is. Thanks.
So Fred, I want to make sure we get to, I don't know where you're at on the list, but I want to make sure we get to Nathan's question about the advanced care directives.
Yeah, and I think that I'm not sure where Nathan is. I see Matthew Simpson looks like he might be the next person. But we'll be sure to do that.
Hi, my name is Matthew Simpson. I'm a deacon in the Episcopal Diocese of Pennsylvania. I'm also a registered nurse. In pre-COVID times, I'm a cardiac nurse. In COVID times, I'm on a cardiac COVID step-down unit and COVID PCU unit. So just echoing, I'm very thankful for the chaplains who are taking care of staff or going to be with staff. I think it's much needed right now, where we are in active collective trauma. I think I've lost, before COVID, I lost 2 patients, and then within 3 weeks I've lost 10. And they don't die well because families can't see the patient. So do everything you can, but don't intubate or don't do this. And what ends up happening is you have patients who are basically fish out of water and suffering. They're also alone. And because we are isolating patients, and a lot of them are demented. We have to restrain them. So during the night shift, it's all screams throughout the night. It's really not a fun thing. One thing I'll say is for chaplains, be patient with nurses. I'm ordained, and a chaplain comes up to me and I still don't know what to do with them, right? I'm like, what do you want from me? And I only know how to relate in spiritual care, how my patient's doing. So I'll talk about this patient died or this patient's intubated. So I'm trying to work with the chaplains to see if there's a spiritual support group that can be done. I saw that was mentioned before. So a spiritual support group for nurses, how do you deal with this collective trauma? Another thing I'll say is that for Jefferson Network, which is where I work with, families can come to visit, but many aren't because they're afraid of this disease. There's going to be a lot of unresolved grief after this with the family members who have died. So have that on your radar. It's on mine that these are families who have not been able to say proper goodbye. They haven't been through a grief process that is healthy. And so just be on the radar for unresolved grief. I know we're coming up on time, so that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
No, thanks very much, Matthew. I'm glad that you raised those issues, and it's good to have your perspective. In scanning through the chat list, it looks to me.
While you're looking, can I just, for Matthew, first I want to thank you for everything that you do every day and how you are present to patients and how you come alongside them and you're there with them. So thank you for everything that you do. And I will say that right now, we're looking at not waiting until we're through the pandemic. We are addressing providing spiritual care and grief support to families as their loved one dies. So we're following up with them and seeing, do they have a spiritual connection or some type of connection, and providing them with rituals that they can develop outside of their traditional ones that can help them with the grieving process. If we wait till the very end, like you said, it's going to be too much. So I would encourage all of us to start now with helping anyone we know to start processing their grief. We're grieving because we are sheltered at home, or we've lost this, or we've lost that, or so we need to lead by example and start our grieving as well. So thank you so much, Matthew.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marilyn. In scanning the chat, Judd Hugh, I couldn't tell whether you had a question or whether you had found your response to care for those in nursing homes.
Yeah, it's kind of like a question, but also wonder if anyone can give me some input about right now there's a hotspot of a nursing home who they're losing a lot of patients and the staff are getting infected. And I happen to have the opportunity to open a sort of like a grief processing, grief support group for them every week. I just wonder, you know, what experience you may have, or Matthew just gave me a very good warning or an example to think about unresolved grief. And there's definitely a lot of disenfranchised grief over there for healthcare workers because they would just keep working without properly taking care of themselves.
Thanks, Judd. Can anyone speak to nursing home care?
Marilyn again. So I would, it's kind of a variety of things. When we're talking about the team members or the healthcare workers, there's, and maybe Fred, you can help me with getting email addresses and I can email information to people. Still Points, and there's another one that I can send you links that actually encourage people not necessarily in a group, but as individuals to care for themselves. So you may have to ask people, so did you sit in silence for 15 minutes yesterday? Did you stop and eat lunch? Did you wash your hair? So it's like a check-in, and it provides them with a resource to say, okay, remind me to stop and pause, or I can follow up. Then for patients, and especially those with dementia, it becomes very hard to, because they're already grieving, if you will. And I have a couple of resources, a couple of links for some resources with primarily around music and resources that, of course, we have to leave in the room, right? Or coloring or something that takes people back to their childhood that helps them to kind of process.
Marilyn, thanks
Just
for that.
one quick thing to add to what Marilyn said. The Chaplaincy Innovation Lab is a great resource. You can just do a quick Google search for it. And then the thing that's helpful is right at the very top, it says COVID-19 resources, and you can identify whether you're a healthcare chaplain, a prison chaplain. And so they're compiling resources from chaplains in very different disciplines, where you can get some really great ideas like what Chaplain Marilyn was alluding to. There's really some great stuff out there right now that's very creative.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was also going to add that, so in the small city where I was a pastor for a number of years, one of the nursing homes actually had one of their nurses was sort of in charge of continuing ed for staff. And so I had a relationship with her, and she was often calling in myself, other people to do programs for the staff, to, one-on-one or in groups. And so again, if there are those kinds of people, and that's getting back to this relationship strategy thing, if there are people in your healthcare systems and networks that you can develop a relationship with and offer particular expertise, they're often very, very open to that.
Thanks, Daniel. Marilyn, if you have an email address that you don't mind sharing in the chat line, the most efficient way for people to contact you for further information might be to use the email that you provide. Nathan Baker Trinity, a question about advanced care directives for the elderly.
Yeah, Nathan Baker Trinity. I'm a parish pastor in Minnesota. I'm wondering about advanced care directives and whether those are going to need to be altered or expanded in light of COVID and future pandemics. And I guess I'm a little confused, where do those fit into hospitals' incident command control protocols? Big thing I hear, number one thing I hear from elderly in my congregation is they do not want to go to the hospital because they do not want to die alone. And they want to make that abundantly clear no matter what health issue they have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know my own response, and from experience of having navigated some of that with parishioners and also with my own family, I think that maybe at a minimum what this pandemic has done is revealed another way in which we need to think about advanced directives and be rather more specific about what our will is in that regard. I think most of us presupposed a situation where we would not be separated from loved ones, a situation in which if we were in the hospital and we were dying, we would still be surrounded by our family. And this has created a completely new situation for us that I think probably requires that we take that into account in terms of the sort of outline of directives that we leave, because there have been stories of people who have been simply spirited away by an ambulance, taken to a hospital, deteriorated, died, and were buried without a family member being present.
Yeah, I mean, Nathan, this is a really important issue that you bring up, and there are still far, far too many people that do not have healthcare directives. And there are far, far too many doctors and primary care people that have not talked to their patients about having advanced directives. And yeah, I think that, again, because the average person is so unaware of what happens in these super high-tech hospital situations, we kind of have no idea the sort of nightmare kinds of scenarios that people can end up in, and also the confusion for staff. My future daughter-in-law is an ER nurse in Seattle, and she just told us 2 weeks ago about this horrible experience with this, very unwell person that came to the hospital. Ended up as a full code because they had no information, no directive. Underwent all kinds of horrible things happening to them, put all kinds of staff people at risk, and then died, right? And so I do think that, particularly when we think about the role of a parish pastor and priest, this could actually be a very important role. And I used to do this all the time in my parish, would be to talk to people about this. And again, the number of folks that don't have this is really significant, and it's extremely important.
Mm-hmm. We built in that if someone comes to the hospital, if they're able to communicate, one of the first things we ask them is, who do you trust? Right? And hopefully you've communicated what you've trust them to say on your behalf. I'm with Daniel. This is an opportunity for healthcare chaplaincy and community clergy to partner together, to invite the chaplain to come and to give a presentation on advanced care planning, not just completing a document, but being able to articulate what's important to you. And there are resources out there, the Conversation Project and others, on how to actually have those conversations in a safe space that are very emotional conversations, so that you can document what's important to you and who do you trust to be able to speak on your behalf. So shoot me an email, I can shoot you that information too.
Thanks,
that Conversation Project is really good.
Yes.
I would note that Matthew makes the observation that he believes that there is a do not hospitalize option with advanced directives, and that it is a good idea for people to consider having those included in their provisions from a fairly early age. And there's also an observation from Edward Holland that he does advanced care planning and health care directives, lives in Shoreview, Minnesota, and his email is near the bottom of the chat, and he's willing to help people think through those issues. It looks to me like we've maybe got barely just enough time for one final question, and that is this giving us an opportunity to take a look at previous HIPAA blocks to pastoral care?
So I can say one thing around that. The Department of Health and Human Services has relaxed HIPAA restrictions right now, but, and this is a big but, every hospital is different in how they interpret that. So, so there is a little bit of relaxation, but again, every hospital is different. I really think HIPAA is important. I am a big believer in it, especially if you know the backstory behind why it started, which at another time, I'm happy to share that story. If you're curious, you can email me and I'll tell it to you. Patient health information really does need to be protected. And it is really an issue. Like, I'll give you an example. I was on the train the other day, and people, this was pre-COVID, and there were people talking, and they were giving so much detail about a patient they were caring for. I could go find them if I really wanted to. They were not at either hospital we do ministry in, by the way. I just want to put that piece out there. They're in another hospital. But it's really, really important. You know, I don't want all my stuff out there. I don't want people to know what my blood pressure is or what my health concerns are. So I think HIPAA gets a really bad name, especially clergy who miss the days where you can go in a hospital, get a list of all the Episcopalians or United Methodists and go visit them. But it's there for good reason. And most health systems that I'm aware of really do allow chaplains who are part of the medical team, to go in and do everything they need to do. And any time that I go see a patient and they're really active in their church, if I ask them for permission, can I call the pastor at First Baptist to say you're here? And they say yes, I can do that. Now, I can't tell them their whole prognosis and things like that, but I can at least facilitate those conversations. So I still think it's really important. And I would just check in with your local hospital to see how they're interpreting that relaxation Health and Human Services has done, because it might be as simple as being able to FaceTime a family and a doctor, or using different ways of connecting.
Thanks very much, Tommy. Thank you. You might put your email at the bottom of the chat list too, if you have an email that people can use. Before we close, let me call on Shane Nichols, who would just like to have a word or two with you before we finish.
I appreciate that. First and foremost, really, truly, thank you all for your time and the great conversation today. We really appreciate that. As I was listening to you all, I was realizing each of us have probably a number of resources that we could point to. And I'm also keenly aware that our chaplains on our panel are probably extremely busy these days. So rather than flooding their emails, why don't you all send all of the resources that you think would be equivalent and helpful for this group to seminary.relations@garrett.edu, and I'll put that in the chat in just a second here. I will gladly compile all of that, and then when I send this video out, I can send those resources along as well. And maybe that will spare Chaplains Rogers and Barnes' email from being flooded by this group. We're still happy to provide those emails so that if you have further, conversations, questions, what have you, we certainly want to be able to use them as resources. But otherwise, seminary.relations@garrett.edu. If anyone wants to send resources, and whether that be PDFs or web links or what have you, send them there, and I will compile those for the group.
Thank you so much, Shane. I didn't want to volunteer you that way. Make sure I have your email address correct there in the chat line. And please do send those materials there, and we'll make them available to all of the participants. Friends, colleagues, it has been a delight to spend some time with you reflecting on this. I think we find ourselves at a time and in a place where we are not just reading about church history and about the lives of our faith communities. We are actually in the middle of some fairly significant historical changes. And our prayers are with you as you grapple with those issues and you find creative and life-giving ways forward. My thanks to the panelists. My thanks to all of you for being present with us and for sharing insights into the challenges that we're facing. God bless you and keep you and give you peace.